good afternoon or good morning, good evening, depending on where you're based. My name is Maria Roldi. I'm welcoming you to this session called Outcomes for Institutional Reform. I'll just give you some house-holding reminder, and then I'll pass over to Giulio Pasi, who is our chair. As you might know, the conference is a hybrid conference, so we have participants online. I invite everybody to put the name and the organization that they are from next to their name, so that it's easier for networking purposes. And we have people in Oxford who I invite, as usual, you can join on Zoom too to see the conversation happening online, but keep your the volume of your computer off so we don't have an echo. I suggest that one of the things I would like to start us off, because we've been hearing from our panelists throughout these 2 days, and we can read their profiles online. I wonder if I can kick us off by asking you to put in the chat why you're here. Like, what would you like to find out in this particular session? And hopefully we can come back to that together with the Q&A you might have later on in the session. But I'll give you like 1 minute to say, like, I'm here because this is what I'm curious about. And I forgot to mention, I think the session is being recorded. And so by participating, you agree with the recording. Okay, as you fill in the question, I'll introduce Giulio, who is our chair for today. Giulio is the scientific officer at the European Commission Joint Research Center and is joining today from Seville in Spain. So Giulio, I'll hand over to you, and I will keep an eye in the room when there are questions coming from the room, and I'll let you know.
Thank you, Mara. Well, I would start saying that, well, what we have seen also yesterday, and what is coming out in the debate around outcome-based contracting, outcome-based approaches, is that, well, all this is about, let's say, our social fabric and the way in which systemic change could be achieved. Now, the question I have is, and I mean, just to open a bit the debate, is do we really believe that outcomes-based approach can achieve a systemic change? Now, being the most of us coming from academia and, let's say, purpose-driven world of practitioner, I think we need to be really honest about this. And let's make a very quick exercise looking at the numbers we have today. And thanks, for instance, to the impact bond database, which is part of the Indigo initiative, which is a very interesting one, especially for those doing research. Now, we have about 200 impact bonds. We have about $500 million of investment and almost 1 million direct beneficiaries, I would say. Now, let's assume in a couple of years, we reach 10 times these numbers. So 2,000 impact bonds, about 5 billion investments, 10 million beneficiaries. Do we really believe this is a systemic impact? And doesn't sound a bit of an exaggeration saying we are going to get a systemic change. Now, I think that to be systemic, a change should affect the rules of the game, changing the rules of the game, and the broader setting in which the game is played. So I personally believe that if we don't understand how outcome-based approach brings a contribution to the field of institutional reform, which is exactly the rules of the game and the setting in which we are called to play as a society, we won't be able to, let's say, reasonably say that outcomes-based approaches are at the core of the systemic change we look for. So a better understanding of the relation between systemic change, institutional reforms, and outcome-based approach is of the utmost importance, I believe. This is because what is at stake is the credibility of the outcomes-based approach. And so a big challenge ahead of us, which makes me, let's say, really happy to be here and grateful to Mara and the Go Lab team for the invitation. And when you deal with big challenges, the best thing you can look for is to have good partners to deal with the challenges. And today we have some very good partners to discuss the issue of outcome-based contracting and outcome-based approaches in dealing with institutional reforms. And I will quickly, briefly introduce them now, and then we can get to the debate. I mean, the idea is to have a discussion, a very informal discussion, touching upon some of the, let's say, hot topics in the field of outcome-based approaches and institutional reforms. So we have Avnish Gogandardos, who is the managing partner and co-founder at Instiglo. We have Rama Alier, who is the Director General of the WPP India Foundation. We have Zoykorkein Kazi, who is lecturer at the School of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at the Bib University. We have Max French, who is lecturer at the Newcastle Business School, Northumbria University. And we have Javier Fuenzalida, who is postdoctoral research fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government, Oxford University. So I think that we could get to the main discussion now, considering that, well, in light of what I said about this systemic change and the need for a clear view on what the change should be about, I think it is worth to look at what some scholars argue, when it comes to the theory of change in outcomes framework. Someone is saying that theory of change in outcomes framework is a kind of reductive and takes no account of the complexity we have to face. Others, that is a kind of useful means to an end, so providing a basis for conversation around the pathway from interventions to outcomes. So what is at stake here is the inner nature of an outcomes focus, and if we think for instance, result-based financing, I mean, this is predominantly viewed through the lens of financial. It's a financial perspective with the lens of financial incentives, and nevertheless, if we look at outcomes-based approaches as a tool for advancing institutional reforms, the financial aspect can be the only one. For instance, a clear and broad and bold theory of change could be an important factor. So, I mean, here we are not speaking about classical and linear theory of change, because what we have seen is that there is no linear relationship between cause and effect, but we have to deal with complexity of what we have defined as institutional reform. So what is it about an outcomes focus that helps or hinders institutional reforms? I mean, in other words, what I would like to ask Avnish, to start with Avnish, I would ask him, what other attributes of outcomes approaches besides the financial points, let's say, can drive impact?
Yeah, thanks, Giulio, and welcome to everyone to the session. Thanks for having me. Perhaps I'll start by conceptualizing what we mean by outcomes-based financing, because I think sometimes people have a single structure in mind. But results-based financing, if you actually look and compare all the different projects and approaches that have been deployed, the only way to kind of really describe that approach is actually it's a set of management decisions of how to deliver. Regarding whether you want to track things or not, how to measure progress, what targets to set for your teams, and how to recognize and motivate success. And I think any single manager in any single industry in the world has to struggle with those questions if they want to actually ensure progress is happening on whatever they're working on, right? So I think we really need to enlarge, our view of this practice when talking about it. I would just like to start with that. Then the second to a question about the sort of broader theory of change, it's worth pointing out that, our approach to institutional reform has really evolved over the last 4 decades. If you think of the beginnings of, not the beginnings, but one important milestone back in the 80s was the IMF structural adjustment program. That was the sort of brute force approach to institutional reform. And now you're talking about things today like problem-driven iterative approaches or thinking and working politically. All these approaches are very different from where we started. So the approach of the development sector to institutional reforms has really evolved. And we recently did a literature review on that. And what we see is there's at least like 3 trends in the evolution. And I'll link that to results-based financing at the end. One is, the approaches have become much more iterative and flexible. So it started off being, very rigid. This is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it, to actually recognizing, to your point, Giulio, that there is complexity in reforms. And we need to problem solve our way to the solution and constantly iterate and provide flexibility to the reform pathway, if you will, so that we can get success. So that's been one movement of giving autonomy and flexibility to reform leaders. The second movement has been to move beyond legal frameworks, to not just think about how do we change the formal rules, but to now also start thinking about how do we integrate sort of reform in the day-to-day operations of institutions, because we recognize that sometimes in the formal world things change, but in the actual real life of what happens in institutions, we don't see the change happening. So that's the second movement of really focusing on the ultimate results. Is this reform actually, leading to a different behavior for an institution, and is that leading to a different outcome for citizens? So there's been a greater results orientation over time, if you will. And the final thing is really empowering local delivery leaders to be the leaders of reform, as opposed to having externally led designs and solutions from DC or from London being imposed in XYZ countries. We're starting to see much more ownership being put on the actual leaders of institutions engaging in reforms to lead the problem solving, lead the reform process. So to summarize, the general trend has moved from rigid to flexible, from normative, so like legal, like formal reforms, to results-oriented reforms, and from externally led to locally led. And why do I mention that? Because I think this represents a little bit, where results-based financing is trying to pick up the baton and bring it to the next level. And when we look at what doesn't work in reforms, it usually is the fact, the sort of like inability to properly engage with complexity that really makes reforms fail. And we recognize that, for reforms to succeed, you need to have like great local context, you need to have really a strong focus on results, and you need to have like flexibility. And that's basically the theory of change of results-based financing. Is not really about just giving incentives. It's actually, the incentives oftentimes is just simply helping us create a holding environment where there's a very clearly defined set of measurement, and when there is some sort of motivation to achieve it. But ultimately, the fourth sort of like pathways or mechanisms of impact, or that results-based financing and outcomes-based financing can draw attention to outcomes that were previously not being measured and not being tracked. It can also align different stakeholders. Recently we were doing a reform, we were helping a reform in the utility sector in Sierra Leone, and you have to align the regulator, the government of energy, and the utility. So creating this alignment of stakeholders on a single objective of the reform is also a powerful mechanism of impact. And my own sort of like observations of the most powerful mechanism is actually about giving flexibility and autonomy to reform leaders. When you engage in an outcomes-based financing modality, you actually move away from this input-based and activity-based mindset, and you're actually focusing and controlling the results. So that gives a lot of flexibility to the reform leaders to decide what technical assistance they need, as opposed to just being injected with whatever else everybody else thinks is needed. What capacity needs to be built, when does that happen, what's the right sequence, how to like manage the workload during the reform. So all these decisions are actually delegated and extremely sort of like the reform becomes an extremely malleable and flexible pathway that can adapt with as we discover what needs to be done in this complex environment, right? So that's been kind of, I think, the most powerful way of unlocking impact in reforms. And we've seen that in the Sierra Leone utility reform, where, the MCC, the Minimum Charge Corporation, gave about $1 million just based on results of a bunch of institutional capabilities and results being achieved. And the reform leaders, who were the utility leaders, were able to decide what to invest in, when to invest in, and how to lead that process. And that was a big driver of result. So I think that these are the different, drawing attention to results, aligning stakeholders, and providing autonomy to frontline reform leaders are the other, if you will, mechanisms of impact, in addition to the monetary, incentive, which I must say, I think, just to finish on that, when we think about monetary incentive in the organizational context, this can be very different to when you're thinking of pay for performance for an individual at the front line, right? For an organization like a utility that has an annual budget of 10 million, $1 million of free cash to invest in different things that they need is extremely motivating for the organization, and doesn't necessarily crowd out the kind of intrinsic incentives that you'd be worried about crowding out at the front line with individuals, right? So that's something else I wanted to point out. But I hope this answers your question, Julia, but let me know if there's anything I missed. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Avnish. I mean, this is really interesting. I'm always really surprised. I mean, when I see when someone with your experience help me to see, let's say, the way in which things are changing, and let's say the dynamic behind what we often wrongly assume as a kind of static things. So theory of change, we know what a theory of change is. We know what a theory of change approach is, and that's it. But it doesn't work in that way. And I mean, these three changes you mentioned. So basically, I mean, it's a kind of play of words, but I mean, theory of change is changing. So the way in which, at least, theory of change is used is changing, and to this extent, I'm thinking. I'm looking at Max. Max did some work on theory of change, the use of theory of change frameworks, and well, I think that one of the key points, and I would like Maxi to elaborate on this, is on the way in which theory of change could help, let's say, in making intentions clear. So could you pick up on this? I mean, you've done a lot of work on this, and I think it's very relevant.
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. I think I'm on board with Avnish for the most part. I think outcomes and outcomes-based approaches are one way of being intentional about social change, and theories of change, at least conceptually, are a great and coherent way of doing that. So they make your intentions and your assumptions explicit. I think where it goes wrong is where you convert the theory of change into kind of a straitjacket that prevents you adapting, and you take it a bit too seriously. So you assume that the things that you predict are definitely going to happen. And so when further down the line, people find that, hey, these KPIs that I'm being required to report on or to achieve, they're no longer relevant, or they're based on faulty assumptions, then the link between intentionality and that theory of change has been lost. So I think that's kind of, it depends on how the theory of change is used. I think, as Avnish kind of described there, there's a standardized static view of causality and a universalism attached to theories of change, often in program management and project management, that maybe if that's a realistic prospect, you're not being ambitious enough. And I think where theories of change can help, and there's lots of examples Avnish has just described, is when you use the theory of change in an iterative way, you articulate your assumptions and you use the theory of change to kind of reflect on them. You make your assumptions vulnerable to testing and revision and challenge as well. And the other thing I think is that they can be used in a more participative way. So they can pull people together, aggregate knowledge. It can be a more shared endeavor. And so it can have a role in a more of a partnership-based approach. And I think the problem probably comes from, well, two things. People tend to like theories of change because they allow us to reduce complexity and simplify things. So they adopt them in that way. But also the big models, log frames, a lot of branches of program theory, for instance, that's kind of what they promise. So I think maybe there's a presentation and a utilization issue there.
Julio, can I make a comment?
Sure.
I find this conversation fascinating, like talking about theory of change, especially in the context of the topic of today on the use of outcomes for institutional reform. Because often when we look at outcome contracts, we think about, oh, there is the program. And the outcome is the education, the results from the test score of children at the end of this educational program. But when we talk about institutional reform, I think there is often the debate that the paying for outcomes as part of these instruments are a sort of Trojan horse. That you're doing it because you want to bring a mindset. And I think sometimes it's the case, sometimes it's not. In my experience, what really brings it to life is when you ask people that design these instruments, what is your exit strategy? So why are you doing this particular program and you want to fund it in this particular way? At the end of this program, it's 2 years, 3 years, 7, whatever it is, do you plan to redo it again? Or is it a learning exercise? And so I think when you ask people, what do you do at the end of this program that is financed with an outcome-based approach, you really get into what is the underlying theory of change of using the instrument. Because there is a theory of change of a particular educational program, but then there is a parallel theory of change of why paying for outcomes in doing so. And sometimes it's difficult to distinguish the two. And I find that when I challenge stakeholders that come at the Go Lab, like, but why doing it with an outcome framework? Like, at the end of these 3 years, what will be different? And I think the question of what is the exit strategy really brings the theory of change of using an outcome approach. And sometimes they say, oh, because we want to do more of those things. Like, oh, okay. Fine, if that satisfies you. But other times there is really deep thinking of, oh, I want to change the relationship between these type of institutions. I want to strengthen the capacity of these particular players. And so there is a thinking beyond the particular program. And so I find the conversation on the intentionality and the theory of change really relevant because it distinguishes the theory of change of the program from the theory of change of the mechanism that you use to structure the relationships.
Thank you, Mara. I mean, this is very interesting. I mean, your comment on this point, what exit strategy one has, no, when the project is over. That's a big question, and it's also a way exactly to unveil, let's say, the degree and the direction of the intentionality. So I think this is really interesting. And on this, I would, move on again on intentionality, which is sometimes confused with the, let's say, the motivation. So it could be interesting to dig a bit on intentionality and motivation between, let's say, different frameworks that can be, coming from legal requirements or nudging from the public sector, or just, from the bottom of the hearts of those who are playing the game. But the thing is, I believe Rama has a very interesting experience to share with us on this, and she will tell us what's going on in India with this angle. No, I mean how to push and to work on intentionality. Is it something that comes, spontaneously? Is it something that needs to be work out, with some helps? What are your thoughts, Rama?
Firstly, thank you for having me here. It's also nice to see people in person. I'm almost envious of people who are attending in person. To your question, Giulio, if you look at it in the Indian context, I think we're in a unique position where being socially responsible or doing good is almost, it's legislated by the government. So we're the only country where the CSR bill mandates that companies of a particular size and a certain amount of profit have to contribute 2% of their profit towards corporate social responsibility, towards the areas identified by the government. Before I get into really answering your question, I just want to quickly sort of, talk about the background or the history or the why, so we're able to appreciate why the bill has come in. I think if you look at it historically in India, we've been a land of the haves and the have-nots right from the beginning. So if you look at the time when we were ruled by kings and queens, I think loyalty was something that was unconditional, and in exchange, the people were looked after in terms of everything from infrastructure to healthcare to disaster, poverty management, all those issues which are being addressed right now. If you look at it post the sort of industrialization, I think it was the same ethos that carried on. So a lot of the Indian companies set up factories in remote areas. And the only way they could get employees to move to those areas was if they could take care of the entire ecosystem. So everything from building the infrastructure to taking care of healthcare, setting up schools so that children would move there. Was something that each of the corporates took on. And in exchange, employees joined an organization and retired out of those organizations. My grandfather sort of started working with the Tata Group, and I think when he was 20, and retired out of that organization. And that was pretty much the way a lot of the Indian companies worked. So as a state, I think social welfare is something the state has never looked at. At individual levels in homes, all of us, it's unspoken, but we all look after the staff that work with us, whether it's your help, whether it's your drivers, because we just know that the state doesn't do it. When the MNCs came in, I think there was a sort of a change in the way of working that wasn't really in the ethos of those organizations, and that caused a gap between what the state was providing and what corporations or what companies were providing. So the CSR bill has really come in to plug that gap and to put the responsibility back on companies to address certain areas that the government, doesn't address right now, and it's just expected that the ecosystem will address it. Couple of things. When the bill came out about 8 years back, were companies happy about it? No. I think most people wished it away. The second phase, I think people looked for loopholes to see how they could sort of look at the work that they were doing and sort of realign it under CSR. Today, I think 2 governments have changed and people know it's here to stay. So it's not being questioned, but I don't think companies are happy about it. I don't think it's something that excites people or is something that they really would like it to be. But I think what it has done is it's become a boardroom discussion because it's here to stay and people know it's here to stay. The second thing that it's done is there's a lot more accountability and transparency, and to that extent focus on impact or the change that you create as opposed to sort of just putting in the money, because now people want to know where the money is going, shareholders are asking questions. I think the third thing that it really does is it does in many ways force public-private civil societies to work together to create the impact. And mostly, I think what it's really done is we've started seeing results. So I would say that's a positive move for us.
Thank you, Rama. You mentioned that at the beginning there was no excitement about this legal provision that basically was framing the CSR as a new layer to the let's say set of compliance burdens from the shareholders' perspective, I think it would be interesting to listen to Kazi, who worked on urban development in Karachi, and because of course, I mean, it looks like we we need, this intentionality. And I mean, if through a legal provision we are able to push and to force, that would be, let's say, a good starting point. Or someone say it's even enough, no? So the question is, how do you see the role of intentionality? Do we have, I mean, is everything about setting the right framework to nurture the intentionality and to generate big changes, or there is something more we need on this?
Okay. Thank you, Giulio, for this question, and thank you very much for having me. It's amazing. I mean, I feel privileged sharing this platform with the fellow guest speakers here. So before I respond to the question, I'd just like to highlight that most of my responses will come from a context of a developing country, and specifically the work that I've been doing, as you mentioned, in the area of urban development, where we were trying to look at the idea of urban development from human rights perspective, specifically focusing on the cases and the instances of forced evictions. Now, already there are international conventions there to guide the intentions of the stakeholders as to what they should rather be doing. So for me, intentions basically are the reflection or the manifestation of the actual work or the actual actions of the stakeholders. So that's for me the intentions. But I think that there is more than just intentions that we really need, because like I said, there are international conventions here in regards to urban development, which basically technically do guide the government and the stakeholders how they're supposed to go about the urban development, and also how they're supposed to undertake forced evictions. But why are they not doing it? So when the actions are not in compliance with the expectations, so we would just simply think that perhaps there is an issue with intentionality. But I think, like you mentioned, that there is a need of having a rightful framework, which basically moving beyond just intentions. But then the question would be as to what is that right framework? So for me, the rightful framework would first include the identification of all the actors, be it direct or indirect, who may be relevant in a certain policy domain or a certain policy subsystem. Then after that, I think along with intentions, it's also very important to identify the alliance or the alignment of the intentionality of all the actors working, or all the actors relevant to a certain policy domain. And in case if the actors are not identified and the intentions are not aligned, this could possibly lead to exclusion of certain actors, and that actually paves way to systematically generate human rights violations. And along with intentionality and their alignment, I think there's also a need to also factor for a potential possibility of hidden biases that may exist within the institutions, and also gauging the understanding of the humanitarian expectations by all these stakeholders who might be involved in order to bring about a certain social outcome. So for me, I think along with these intentionalities, I think all these factors, identification of actors, alignment of intentionality, factoring for potential possibility of hidden biases, and also the understanding of humanitarian expectations are all the things which basically, because the context from where I'm drawing all these factors, basically like the way urban development is basically unfolding in the context of Karachi, it's systematically generating a constant reproduction of human rights violations. And it's also constantly, highlighting or widening the institutional governance fractures, which basically is the manifestation of clashing institutional intentionality. So for me, just to sum up, I think we really need to move beyond intentions and consider other factors as well to rightfully aim for the social outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazi. This is well, probably if we have to sum it up, I would say that, well, intentionality is not enough. It's not enough, at least because we have 2 points. The first one is there are different degrees of intentionality, and it's not always easy to detect the true intentionality in setting up any projects and let's say the direction of the reform. And another aspect I think it's interesting is beyond let's say the degree of intentionality is that, well, there is always a risk of, let's say, kind of inconsistency between the intentionality, regardless, I mean, it's really felt or not, but the issue of the consistency between the intentionality and the outcomes. And I think we should come back to this later. Now, what I would like to stress is again on these different degrees of intentionality, and that, well, something I was asking myself, and I would like to call back Max on this, is do we need excitement to be allowed, to talk about intentionality? I mean, is excitement a kind of proxy for intentionality, and how do outcomes frameworks could somehow help in this excitement generation and to push for an increased and stronger intentionality?
Thanks, Giulio. I think it's a really interesting scenario we're in just now, where, like from Rama's presentation, outcomes can provoke like a sigh of despair rather than any degree of excitement. And it's it's a bit mystifying, because what outcomes and outcomes approaches do is they kind of invite you to imagine a better future. So as a visioning exercise, why aren't you excited by that, by the possibilities that kind of affords? And I think it's kind of a problem with the field, because I think the way that outcomes in recent years have been, and recent decades, I think it's broadening now, but tended to be kind of communicated and understood as sort of technical elements of, say, contracting or performance management processes. And that those technical elements are kind of linked to a series of headaches, like how on earth are we going to make people accountable? How on earth are we going to fill the data gaps? How are we going to engage stakeholders? All these really knotty kind of issues. And they come first rather than, hey, what we're trying to do together. So I think that's kind of quite a significant issue, that the outcomes are positioned as technical elements rather than aspirations. And the aspirational kind of side of it is seen as, well, that's nice, but that's fluff. Actually, how do we do the implementation? So I think the outcomes that we care about, we either don't know how to achieve them fully, the evidence base is always limited, or even if we did, we kind of lack the power to change things ourselves. So that's why I think fundamentally outcomes should kind of be thought of as hearts and minds issues rather than measures and management issues. And to that extent, they kind of live or die by their ability to excite people. And I think that, if you take the best known outcomes framework, which is recognized by, I think, 2/3 of adults globally, which are, of course, the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals and their associated indicators, that's an outcomes framework that doesn't have any roadmap. It doesn't tell people how to achieve them. It doesn't have any means of accountability. It can't force people. It's the UN. So what's its implementation strategy? I think it starts with getting people excited about outcomes and convincing them to care. And beyond that, enabling them to access that kind of vision in a way which is relevant to their own circumstances. And I think what we tended to do is position outcomes in a kind of a management approach that's linked to kind of hard power, which is your ability to kind of enforce adoption or pay people based on performance. So force and payment. But actually, a lot of it's about soft power, and it's about the credibility, the perceived legitimacy, and the cultural pull that outcomes frameworks can kind of bring, and that motivates people to sign up to either adopt outcomes or to begin to negotiate changes in their own behaviour, to look at things differently. So in the paper I submitted to this conference, I called that mechanism performance attraction. So your ability to use outcomes and outcomes frameworks to attract people to your cause, change behaviour through persuasion and indirect influence rather than enforcement and contractualism. And I think there's quite a lot of institutions that are using outcomes frameworks like that without the intention or the kind of consciousness of it. And a recent paper, for instance, with Ali Mollinger-Saba, who's a researcher at the University of Western Australia, who looked at the Western Australia Alliance to End Homelessness, which used an outcomes framework as its kind of starting point to spotlight the kind of injustice behind the kind of distribution of homelessness outcomes in the region, and particularly amongst Indigenous Australians. Again, no roadmap, but it used the outcomes framework to rally people around into a long-term sort of change-focused partnership, and to provide them with the tools and the framing and the indicators and the feedback mechanisms that can enable them to kind of get going on that journey. And I think part of the only problem with this approach, of course, is that it doesn't work either. So in a recent paper, I looked at devolved governments and their outcomes frameworks. If you look at Scotland, it had a national performance framework, a really well-developed outcomes framework that kind of unimplemented for about 10 years. So still unlinked to budgeting and strategic planning and all of that sort of thing. And I think what that tells you is that maybe soft power, firstly, they weren't intentional enough about using soft power. They could have done that probably better. But what it might get you towards is lip service and weak vertical, at least, implementation. And I think part of the trick is to be able to kind of structure both elements, the hard powers and the soft powers. And I think that's maybe when you get to real behavior change. But my point is that excitement is a real part of that issue. It can't just be about contractualism and performance management and kind of linear planning. But I can't fully get on board that we need to reject all of that all of the time as well. I think finding the synergy is kind of the real trick.
Thank you, Max. I know Javier did some work, some empirical work on this, and I think it would be interesting to listen from him. Whether, let's say, well, first of all, if he found some excitement in his work, not your excitement, of course, because we are always excited about the work we do. The problem is whether you found some excitement in those who were taking part of your empirical analysis. And well, it could be interesting because, of course, I mean, this idea of using an outcome framework in terms of, hard power and soft power, I think makes a huge difference in terms of excitement, and then in terms of, well, intentionality, degree of intentionality, and probably, I mean, it has something to say on the success or failure of a specific initiative. So it would be interesting to listen to you, Javier.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad to be here with a great panelists and colleagues. Well, one of the problems that we have with this performance management or outcomes-based approach is that most of them, they are externally imposed to public service organizations, and they have a more normative approach. So it's like you should do this or you should do that in order to achieve better performance, right? And actually, we have various in the literature. We have a lot of advocacy for this, like having a stronger performance management approach. We have international organizations that systematically have tell us that we should enforce and pursue these approaches in public service. But the problem is that there is certain untested assumptions, and I would like to go a little bit to Mara's point, which I find it great. It's to the degree to which this public service professionals and managers, they actually use these programs to make decisions. They actually try to take the information that is derived from these programs and from these performance management systems, or and they do something with that. Okay, and this is something, and the evidence of this, it's a little bit fuzzy, I would say. It's not clear whether people in the public service, they actually take this information and they make decisions with that. And so to answer your question, Julio, I would say that I found mixed evidence on this. But there are certain factors that matters for getting more excitement and intentionality of public service professionals to use the information that is derived from these outcome-based programs or performance management programs. And I would like to just summarize these factors, and there are some that are environmental, organizational, and individual factors. In terms of the context, you should involve, and I like very much the what Avnish said about trying to include local delivery leaders, right? Because you need to involve and make people to be interested in your reform, in your program, before trying to ask them by enforcement to just follow them. You need some certain political support. You also have to notice something. Usually, public service organizations, they are they are also embedded in a context in which other performance management systems or programs are operating. So usually the tendency is just to see and one additional requirement to, I don't know, to just register as a certain performance information metric, or try to register performance as one additional just burden, right? So you have to try to convince them to just see value in that action. In terms of there are also certain performance management systems attributes. Whether this is also what I've seen in the literature, and that is highlighted in the literature, is whether the performance management system provides you with learning forums or routines to actually analyze the information and to use that information and translate that information into decisions, right? As I said, usually these kind of approaches are implemented through programs that are externally enforced, right, by a certain ministry, a certain organization, right? So you need to involve employees in that approach, in the design. You need to get that excitement at some point, right? For instance, there is some evidence that the performance management systems that work, they have a clear line, a clear link to the strategic management or the strategic goals of organizations, or certain budget allocations decisions. So that's a way to just get into the reality of the organization, rather than just trying to impose a certain approach. Well, another aspect that perhaps we haven't discussed a little is that whether organizations, they actually have the resources. These approaches, they usually come with certain actions, right? People have to register. They have to register this in IT systems. They have to have the capacity at the organization to actually analyze the data, to track the information. You have to have the capacity in your teams to analyze that information, to be able to analyze, to visualize that information. So those are other important aspects within the organizations. And in terms of the individual features, of course, you need to have at the beginning a positive attitude towards performance management, more flexible decision making. So this goes to this idea of this flexibility and complexity in this area. And one idea, and I totally agree with what Max just said, is when individuals, they do have a perception that this outcomes-based or performance management approach is linked to a higher social impact, they do have this belief. They tend to use more these instruments, these tools, these approaches. So this is also an important feature at the individual level. So those are just my thoughts on this.
Thank you, Javier. Well, I think, well, you mentioned many things that I think are worth to be further explored. But what I would like to do is, and maybe we can come back later to some of these points. What I would like now is to go back to Kwasi, because he said before, basically intentionality is not enough, and often because we have some path dependency, which also you Javier mentioned somehow, indirectly. We have bias, cognitive bias. We have misaligned goals, or we have even misunderstood concepts. I mean, the conceptualization behind the reform, the initiative, the policy measure. So I would like to call back Kazi and ask him, to share some thought on this point, because I think this is important. We are discussing about outcomes approaches, the role outcomes approaches could play in institutional reforms. I think this is very important.
Well, thank you so much for this. I think very interesting insights and very interesting points are being shared by the fellow guest speakers. I mean, if I rightly borrowed from Max's point when it says that outcomes perhaps are not necessarily the measurement tools, but rather sort of a sense of direction that they give to this to the stakeholders to look forward to. In the same way, I think Javier, I know I'm not correctly pronouncing the name, but please pardon me here. I think the point about capability is also interesting, which would also help me in building my response. And more so the Rama's point, particularly about when she actually drew the history of her country in order to give a context to the kind of way the actors are kind of interacting as of now, like the kind of way the corporations perhaps are behaving correctly. So drawing from all these points, I would like to build an argument here that certainly I think that intentionality alone cannot really explain everything. And like I mentioned in my previous comment as well, that for me, intentionality specifically is the actual action of the concerned stakeholders. So if, for example, the stakeholder is not acting in a desired way, maybe, for example, they're not performing the mandated role of regulations, maybe they're not being excited by a certain policy intervention. So that there could be varied reason as to why they are not doing what they should ideally be doing. So for me, along with intentionality, I think we also need to consider the broader constellation of all the actors and governance configuration. And when I say governance configuration, I specifically mean the way those actors are interacting. And when we talk about their interactions, my the understanding that I've drawn from my research on urban development and looking at it from human rights perspective is that just focusing on actors' interaction at a certain point in time, like for example, how are they acting right now, might not be enough. We might have to trace the genealogy or the history of their interactions that has happened over the period of time. Because my learning has been that the actors, like there's always a history, there is certainly and could be a history behind the way actors might be acting, and those historical actions basically build individual experiences of actors and institutions. And those experiences influence the decisions they make. And the recurring instances of the same decisions or the same actions can result in building institutional identities. So therefore this identity may get constantly reinforced and triggered whenever we try to bring in a certain policy intervention to attain a certain socioeconomic or a certain social outcome. Now, to elaborate on this point, I'll just briefly give an overview of my specific case. I mean, the specific case that we are focusing, like I mentioned, focusing on Karachi's urban development, which basically is the economic hub of the country. It's like inhabits more than 20 million people. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the world. So our basic contention was that when urban development takes place, so evictions do take place. And then there are instances of post evictions, but then there is a framework for those instances that human rights violations should not really take place. And we were trying to understand as to why, when we already know this, why the state is actually not respecting that, and why there is no collaboration between the state and the people at the grassroots level. And when we investigated, we identified that there is no local government, or the local government that exists is actually very weak. But then again, that was not enough of a reason. So then we looked at the interaction of the local government with the provincial government. And we found out that the provincial government and local governments are not in perfect alignment. Again, this is their current state. And just looking at this current state would not be enough. So we traced the history of this interaction between the local government and the provincial government. And the history actually went back to 1947, which was when Pakistan and India actually got their independence. And a lot of people came into, and as a result of that, there was a mass migration. Mass migration took place. A lot of people came to Pakistan and a lot of people came to this city. And when there was mass migration, the demographics changed. And so much so that over the period of time, this demographic change also began to be reflected in institutions. And today the state is that the institutions have become ethnicized. So provincial government is controlled by one ethnicity and local government is controlled by another ethnicity. So they are absolutely in no position to collaborate. And when there is no collaboration taking place, there is absolutely no collaboration with the people on the grassroots level. So in this sort of a situation, when we just simply focus on intentionality, I don't think that would really explain the situation, because focusing on just intentionality would give us, or would help us come up with interventions which might be just cosmetic, or perhaps may be relevant or suitable for just attitudinal changes. But these are not attitudinal changes. These are really deep-rooted factors which are basically preventing the institutions to act in a rightful manner. And in fact, the system has actually gotten has been structured in a way that it's constantly reinforcing these ethnic and ethnically led institutional divisions. So, so intentions alone perhaps would not really explain the situation. The history of how interactions have basically traversed or transpired between these actors would also be important to consider. Yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. I mean, you gave us a very good picture of the complexity with which we have to deal with when it comes to institutional reforms. Just a follow-up question to Avnish before going to the Q&A from the public, and I would ask you, Avnish, to be very, very brief, because we are running a bit late with the timing. So what role finance, results-based finance, could play in fostering, the change we are talking about, since it's a very complex one, also that requires changing norms, behaviors, and many other informal rules, let's say, that usually our institutions and the staff and the civil servants follow. So what additional value is brought by result-based financing in fostering this changing in the complex environment we have seen so far?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll try to also connect my comments to this really interesting discussion on intentionality, which I think is really at the core of a lot of the failures in reforms that we see. So, results-based financing, I would think of it as an amplifier of performance when there's already, and it works best when there's already an intention to perform, right? It's really hard. And I'll just maybe give you an example that's really interesting for us to look at. We were working in Sierra Leone, as I mentioned earlier, and we're trying to we're applying this approach of outcomes-based financing to two different utilities. There's an electricity utility and there's a water utility. And interestingly, the water utility performed extraordinarily well in a period of a year and a half, was able to reform things that it had not done for a decade, and it was a huge success story. And the electricity utility actually didn't really meet the targets and was not such a success story. So it offers this kind of really interesting, comparison of why do some institutions succeed, why do others not succeed, and what are the actual factors that are needed to make results-based financing really play out its potential, to draw attention to outcomes, to motivate, to incentivize, and to actually drive performance. And what we notice is that, institutions are always facing extremely complex incentive environments that we very rarely understand fully. And I think Kazi was making that point, previous participants and panelists were also making that point. At the macro level, you have institutions responding to different, regulatory agencies, different political forces that are quite opaque, and it's hard to read what's going on and can change quite rapidly, such a complex incentive environment. Sometimes they're also subject to individual and perverse incentives within the institutions. There are often issues of corruption going on that complex environment of incentives explains often why institutions don't change, and there's a very strong force that keeps them in the status quo. So we have to be very honest when we go and apply outcomes-based financing that it's a small incentive at times compared to this complex forces that maintain institutions exactly where they are and prevents them from moving forward. And that's potentially what was happening in the electricity utility. On the other side, in the water utility, we started off with a motivated leadership. They were actually interested to improve performance. That intentionality was already there. The moment and the reform was aligned to the macro plans of the government. So there's a lot of alignment of the macro environment with that sort of reform intention, and that really empowered the results at the end of the day. So I think that the existence of intentionality, and that brings us back to yesterday's conversation. There's nothing that really replaces good governance. And if that's not present, then you have a lot of chances for an outcomes-based financing program to not actually result in much movement, or for any other approach, for that matter, to reform to not actually work. So it's an amplifier. It's not going to replace governance. I think that would be kind of a first point I wanted to make. And the second point is, really requires good internal capacity in problem solving, in motivating staff, in managing performance, in creating a culture of performance. All of these management capabilities are going to be essential. And if that's present, then results-based financing create the space to unleash the power of that, because we actually tell people, actually the reform is in your hand. You get to decide what to do tomorrow. You get to decide how to create a culture of performance. We're not going to prescribe to you what TA you're going to have to buy, what consultants you're going to have to get, what strategies you're going to have to, implement, but we're actually building that internal capability to learn and to problem solve and to sort of like achieve results, which to Mara's earlier point, I think is a big part of what the macro theory of change of results-based financing is really about. is teaching organizations how to perform, right? And how to overcome challenges and how to achieve a different level of institutional performance and delivery performance. And then the final thing is, results-based financing really works when it's accompanied with proper technical and financial resources. So we need to be honest about the actual effort it takes to reform institutions and be able to properly resource that. And I wanted to end with a note of caution, and goes back to Max's earlier point about theories of change. There are situations where results-based financing may not be really good, especially because it actually involves transaction costs around setting outcomes, changing targets if you need to change that. So there's not an infinite amount of flexibility that you can actually build in these financing structures. And sometimes you are working in environments that are extremely complex, where really the theory of change is unknown or is going to be extremely unstable. What you think you need to do today is going to be very different from what you think you need to do in about 4 or 5 months from now. And you do need to give people this flexibility to just iterate plans and iterate resources, iterate planning. And results-based financing requires you to constantly set milestones, and sometimes you just don't even know what those milestones should be. What should a very dysfunctional institution be in 6 months from now or a year from now? What metrics should we really put forward? Sometimes we really don't know. So we need to be cautious of applying outcomes-based financing in these kind of environments, and perhaps go more towards approaches like iterative problem-driven adaptation, or other types of approaches that actually just building an amazing amount of flexibility and motivates people in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you, Avnish. I would like to see, because I've seen, I couldn't follow exactly all the questions popping out in the chat, but I've seen that there are some questions from the public, and maybe also from someone in the room there. I don't know, Mara, Ruth, are you?
I was wondering, there is a question that Nigel, you posted, that it was picked up about putting out targets and let people see and create this form of public accountability. Can you put forward your provocation?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no. It was, inspired really by the discussions yesterday, not just Joseph Stiglitz, but also the panelists. That actually, we think, and I think we're mostly talking in this session about how to use outcomes to get institutions to change the way they behave, and and then the various different mechanisms there are to do that. But one of the struggles for me has always been how that ties back to public accountability. So I was really attracted to this idea of putting the metrics out there for all to see. And after all, everyone understands GDP. It's one number, but at least everyone understands it. Have we ever really tried to show a dashboard to the public and get them being obsessed with 5 numbers? So I'm attracted to that idea. However, I think it's probably completely impractical, if I'm honest, because how on earth, and we were in a session this morning on measurement, and how on earth do you aggregate up, some of the kind of micro impacts that particular interventions or whatever may have to a national dashboard without, that level of abstraction. I'm not fully bought into. I'm not sure that could be done really. I mean, I know we do it for GDP, but that's all money. At least it's all one type of unit. So anyway, that's my reflection. I don't know whether any
of our panelists would like to pick up and comment. Max.
Yeah, I think it's a really big issue, and so Scotland's had that since 2007. It's had a publicly accessible outcomes dashboard. It's got arrows going up, arrows going down, arrows going sideways, and no one's used it. The press haven't used it. It's not been used for parliamentary scrutiny. It's not been used for budgeting, planning. It's just sort of there. And they do page counts, and the public isn't interested either. So I think it's a cultural and a communications issue. Like, how do you train the various institutions that can enforce public accountability? So charities, think tanks, the press, citizens groups, how to actually access and use that information, I think is a big one. And the UN has done some work on that, but it's not nearly gone far enough. I think it's a gaping hole. I'm not quite as fatalistic about the unusability of that information, but I think it then becomes a political tool, which is vulnerable to all sorts of other misuse and capture and all of that sort of stuff. So it would be interesting to see that done well and where it leads. So I'm not aware of anywhere it's done well. Virginia performs as, the state of Virginia in the US has done it, and I don't think it's got anywhere there either. So I don't have answers, but my intuition isn't quite as fatalistic as that. I think it could lead to interesting places, but it needs to be facilitated. Maybe you could facilitate it.
Thank you, Max. I just had a comment. Like there are good story and bad story about the use of rankings and the naming and shaming. There are some success story in which way it brought change and some bad story, but I remember that the fundamental thing is that it's easy to understand a ranking, like from first to bottom. It has to be public and there needs to be consequences associated with arriving at the bottom. There has been also many side effects, but I have another question here, and then I'll come to you, Giulio.
Yeah, so just a quick one, Rama, about the Indian CSR experience and what Max was saying about hard power and soft power, and I thought was really interesting with CSR because in the Anglo-American world, we're kind of relying almost exclusively on soft power, and we're going to be talking about it again later on today. So it'd be interesting to see what you would think about the Indian experience of using hard power. So the soft power leverage in the UK and the US is associated with studies that have shown that share price value goes up if CSR performance goes up. But in India, when mandatory CSR was announced, share prices went down. Investors perceived that was actually going to lower value. But how has it worked in terms of changing the culture of those businesses working with other actors in society to improve social outcomes? And do you think in your experience that implies anything for how we should use hard power in the Anglo-American experience?
So I think that's a really sophisticated question. There are lots of layers to that. But so I think hard powers work better in India. And I don't know if this is something which works differently in different economies, but with everything, the minute it is legislated, it's not something which is desired, but I think people understand that. And I find a lot of times in the beginning to just get a larger set of stakeholders to be engaged and to realize that they need to make it happen. Hard laws or hard rules really help. We're already at a stage where some of the companies are asking questions about, why it should be mandated. There are some companies where it's mandated at 2%. There's some who are already doing about 3 to 4%. So if you look at the data right now, if you look at the compliance, it's more than 100%. More than even the companies who are not required to spend on CSR are spending. So for the first time, it's more than 100%. Even among the companies who are spending in CSR, a lot of them are spending much more than the 2%. So if you look at it in terms of effectiveness, and also if you look at a lot of the indices that the government is looking at driving the initiatives towards, whether it's malnutrition, whether it's education, whether it's poverty alleviation, the metrics have actually improved in the last 3 years. You can see the data. So it has worked. And I think in a country like ours, we probably need it for a little longer so that people start seeing the benefit in it. I think once people start seeing the benefit in it and people realize it's working and you see a couple of quick successes, that has a life of its own. And I think that will then, it will set the right behaviors. But for people to see that initial success, because social impact takes so long to show and to demonstrate, you need that much time to be able to show that impact. And I think then it will, softer measures will probably work.
Thank you, Rama. Giulia, I'll pass it over to you.
Yes, well, we still have a couple of interventions that I would like to listen to. I don't know whether we have some flexibility, like 5 minutes more or less, better less than. Okay, so what I would like to do now is just to focus a bit on what Javier was mentioning about his research on well, if I'm not mistaken, on schools principals, and because I think it would be interesting to see what reforms looks like at from the front line. So I will give you the floor to you for less than 5 minutes, and then we close.
No problem. Thank you for these minutes to share my research. It's just I totally understand that this intentionality and this more attitudinal approach to outcomes-based reforms and performance management is not enough, right? You need. We have discussed largely about the complexity of this reform. So, but it's essential. Is one important part, and in that regard, we conducted an experiment, a survey experiment in Chile with certain public schools principals, and we tried to test their intention to use real performance information from the educational systems about their own schools. And we just, I will not get into the details about the methods, but we discovered that there are certain attributes about the information that is provided, but also about the environmental factors in which they are, they have to manage their schools, that matters. And they actually serves as a way to leverage their intention to use the information. One of them is the timeliness of the performance information. Sometimes you have decision makers that they receive that information, but it's outdated, or they receive that information in a time that is not appropriate for them. It's just the moment in which they need it passed away. So the timeliness of the performance information matters. And sometimes we have discussed briefly about this, is the accountability demands. So we discovered that the higher the accountability demands of public service or public schools principals, so the higher the intention to use the performance information. In line with what we have previously discussed, at the time when principals, they do have time and protocols, a protected time and protocols to learn from this information, they have a higher behavioral intent to use this kind of performance information. And finally, it's the capacity of teams. We also try we discovered that the higher the capacity. So when they feel that their teams, they do have the capacity, they rely more on this performance information. So it's kind of an incentive. They feel that they have in their teams at schools the capacity to analyze that information. So it's the higher their behavioral intent. And we also find just weaker evidence, but also it's an indication that the formats also matters. Usually, decision makers, they receive just a high report of 500 pages. And so the format matters. So the way in which you present the information through dashboards or one-page executive reports, just incentivize them to make decisions and use that information to manage, right, actually, and to improve their schools. So those are just my 5 cents on this.
Thank you, Javier, and thank you for staying within the 5 minutes. I won't, let's say, summarize what we have discussed so far, because it's too much for me, at least. Well, what I can say is that I learned a lot of new things, and I have a lot of food for thought, and I will work on this my daily job. probably what the perception, the impression I got is that we are living in a kind of permanent institutional reform setting, and it's no longer the issue of adjusting the way in which an institution works or not. I mean, it's something more, it's something deeper. We are under a permanent status of institutional reform, and so the thing is that when you are in this, fast changing environment and permanently changing environment, you need to have some reference point, to shape the way in which you travel throughout this complex environment. And I would say that, I mean, what we are seeing is that outcomes are exactly this reference point to navigate, this new permanent status of institutional reforms. And probably this is also the way in which we can move the governance, make it more flexible, adaptive, let's say. And I would say that this is a way, I mean, following a kind of outcomes-based approach is I mean, it has a main value, which is, you can move from, let's say, control to drift, which is, let's say, kind of Ciborra's approach in governance theory. But I mean, we are moving from control to drift, and to do this, we need a new approach that allows us to drift instead of controlling. And probably, and this is, let's say, the challenge, is to keep working on this, on outcomes-based approaches, because they seems to be, let's say, the way to which we can move, and get into this new generation of permanent new permanent status of institutional reform. So I thank you all very much for this very inspiring session, and I leave the floor to Mara for some final comments.
Yes, I just want to thank you, everyone, for attending this session. It has been a bigger than life session for me, like thinking at these simple instruments for which sometimes we ask big things, including how can this instrument reform an entire institutions. But there has been attempt, or as Giulio was saying, it's not that we go from where we are to a state of equilibrium, like we are in constant motion. And maybe I thought what really stuck with me is the need to, the shift away from the control is really a shift in power that we are looking at. And maybe the power is the power of holding a conversation and defining what good looks like, what type of reform we want to live in, which institution do we want to strengthen and facilitate, and which other institution we think they are not representative of the society we want to live in. But then we need to hand over the control and the power. And that's very scary. So I think this is why the conversation feels like greater than, like we are really grappling with something really, really difficult. That those who can make this decision are the ones who have the power, and asking somebody with power to hand it over is never easy. So I just want to thank all the panelists who joined us from various places in the world, and for a thoughtful discussion. We have a break coming up. For those of us who are here in person, we will have, I think, do we have some coffee? I think so. We have some coffee outside. And the next session is a plenary session on using public procurement to build back better. If you are online, go to the program, usual place, and find the link to join that room. Thank you so much. And thank you, Giulio, for this facilitation.